Clara Dawson stood at the edge of the barren land that had once been a thriving ranch. The wind howled through the empty fields, and the trees, bare of leaves, whispered the story of a time long past. The ranch, once bustling with life, now seemed like a forgotten ghost of the Wild West. Clara's eyes, tired and heavy, scanned the land. It had once been hers and her late husband's, Tom Dawson. Now it was hers alone, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep it together. It had been over 6 months since Tom's sudden death. He had been thrown from his horse during a routine ride, leaving Clara with nothing but memories of the man she loved and a child to raise alone. Their son Ethan was only 5 years old, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened. To him, the world was still full of wonder and adventure, but Clara knew better. Every day was a struggle for her to keep the ranch running and put food on the table. Tom had been the backbone of their family, and without him the task of surviving seemed almost impossible. She wiped a tear from her cheek and looked down at the dirt path leading to the old wooden cabin. Inside, the faint smell of cooking lingered in the air, but the warmth it once held felt like a distant memory. She had tried to keep the home as it was before, full of laughter and warmth, but it was hard. Very hard. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows reminded her that Tom was gone. And with his death, a heavy silence had descended on the house. Clara moved inside, forcing a smile for Ethan, who was sitting by the fire, playing with a wooden toy horse. His innocent face lit up when he saw her, and for a moment all her worries faded. He was the reason she fought every day to keep the ranch running. He was all she had left, and she loved him more than life itself. "Is supper ready, Mama?" Ethan asked, his small voice filled with excitement. Clara nodded, her heart aching. "Almost, sweetheart. You go ahead and finish your game, and we'll eat soon." As she prepared the meal, her mind wandered to the bills that had piled up in the corner of the cabin. The land was struggling to produce enough crops, and the few cattle they had left were growing weaker by the day. Clara had no money to pay for supplies, and without Tom's income, she was sinking deeper into debt. The local bank had already warned her that if she didn't make a payment soon, they would take the land. But where could she turn? Who could help her? Her eyes landed on a letter from Jack Marshall, a cowboy who worked on the neighboring ranch. She had seen him ride past a few times, a tall, rugged figure on his horse with his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his hard face. Jack was known in town as a quiet man, keeping mostly to himself. People said he had a rough past, a man who'd lived through more than his fair share of trouble. But Clara had heard enough whispers to know that he was a good man at heart. A man who would help if the right circumstances came about. She didn't know him well, but she knew he had a reputation for being strong and dependable. She also knew he wasn't married. Her eyes lingered on the letter for a moment longer before she folded it carefully and stuffed it back into the drawer. Could she really ask him for help? Her pride told her not to, but her desperation told her that it was her only chance. She needed help, desperately. That night after supper, Clara sat by the fire staring into the flames, trying to think of a way out of the mess she had found herself in. Ethan had already gone to bed, and the silence was unbearable. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine what life might be like if everything could just be easier. What would it take to save the ranch? What would it take to make her son's life better than her own had become? She sighed deeply. Then, without warning, a thought struck her. What if she asked Jack for help? Not just help with the ranch, but help with something more. What if she made a bold proposal? She had heard enough rumors about Jack's loner lifestyle. He didn't seem to have any attachments or family of his own. And maybe, just maybe, if she could get him to stay and help her, he could take on the role of a father figure for Ethan. Clara knew she could never replace Tom in Ethan's heart, but perhaps she could give him someone to look up to, someone who could provide the strength and protection she couldn't. The idea felt crazy even as she thought it. What was she thinking? But the more she considered it, the more she realized that it might be her only hope. She needed someone who could step in, someone with the skills to help keep the ranch alive, and someone who could fill the hole that had been left when Tom died. She didn't need to love him, not right away. She just needed someone dependable, someone who could give Ethan the guidance he needed. Clara stood up abruptly, determination surging through her veins. She couldn't wait anymore. Her options were running out, and if she didn't take a chance, she might lose everything. She grabbed her coat and pulled it tight around her shoulders before heading out the door. It wasn't long before she reached the small cabin where Jack lived. The moonlight cast long shadows over the land, and she felt the chill of the night air against her skin. She had never been this bold before, but tonight something inside her pushed her forward. She knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet night, making her heart race. She held her breath, hoping he was home. The door creaked open, and there stood Jack Marshall, looking down at her with a mix of surprise and curiosity. His piercing blue eyes studied her for a moment, taking in her appearance. Clara wasn't sure what to say at first. The words felt stuck in her throat, but she knew she couldn't back down now. "Jack," she started, her voice shaky but steady. "I need your help." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "What kind of help?" Clara swallowed hard. "My ranch is failing. I can't do it alone anymore. I can barely feed myself and my son, and I need someone to help me, not just with the ranch, but with my son too. He needs a father, someone strong, someone who knows how to handle things. I don't know who else to turn to." Jack didn't speak for a moment. His gaze softened, but he said nothing. Clara felt exposed, vulnerable, but she had to say it. "I'm not asking for much. Just help. I'll do whatever it takes. Whatever you need." Jack stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come inside. We need to talk." Clara stepped inside Jack Marshall's cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the faint smell of leather and horse. It was a far cry from the warmth she had once known in her own home, but it was better than the coldness she had been feeling in recent weeks. Jack moved aside, making room for her, and she stepped in, closing the door gently behind her. The small space was sparsely furnished, just a few pieces of rough-hewn furniture and a small fireplace glowing in the corner. Jack wasn't a man who cared much for luxuries. Everything he owned seemed to be practical, meant for survival rather than comfort. He offered Clara a seat by the fire, and she accepted, the warmth immediately calming her chilled bones. Jack didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the wooden wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He studied Clara with an unreadable expression. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The crackling fire filled the silence, and Clara could feel her nerves growing. Was she making a mistake by coming here? Was Jack the man she hoped he was? She couldn't be sure, but she had no other choice. This was her only option. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "You want me to help you with the ranch," he said, his voice low and steady. "But what exactly are you asking of me, Clara?" Clara took a deep breath. The words were harder to say now that she was actually here. She had rehearsed them in her head a dozen times, but now that the moment had come, they didn't seem to make sense. I need help, Jack," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The land is failing, and I can't keep up with the work. I'm not asking for much, just someone who can work the land with me. But more than that, my son Ethan, he needs a man's guidance. He's only 5, and I can't be both a mother and a father to him. You don't have to stay forever, just long enough to help us get back on our feet." Jack listened carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't seem surprised by her request, but the question was still there, unspoken in the silence. Why her? Why now? But he didn't voice it. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if he understood what she was asking without needing any more details. "I'm not the man you think I am, Clara," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, as if the words hadn't been spoken in years. "I've seen things. Done things. Things I'm not proud of. I've lived through a lot, and I'm not looking for any more trouble." Clara's heart sank at his words, but she didn't back away. She had known from the start that Jack wasn't a perfect man, but she also knew that perfection didn't matter in a world like theirs. What mattered was survival, and she needed him. "I'm not asking for perfection, Jack," she said, her voice firm. "I'm asking for help. Ethan needs a father figure, someone strong to look up to, someone who can teach him what it means to be a man. I can't do that on my own. I've tried, but there's only so much I can do." Jack stood still for a moment, his eyes searching hers. It was clear he was torn. He wanted to help, but the shadows of his past seemed to hold him back. His rough exterior, hardened by years of hardship, was difficult to read, but Clara could see the conflict in his eyes. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to risk the connections that might make him vulnerable. He had been running from the past for so long, and he wasn't sure he could face it again. "I've been alone for a long time," Jack said softly, his voice carrying the weight of old wounds. "I've learned to keep my distance from people. I'm no good at family, and I'm no good at being the man you're asking me to be." Clara's heart ached for him. She could hear the sadness in his voice, the pain of a man who had lost so much. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like for him, living in solitude and pushing everyone away. But she couldn't give up. "Not now. I'm not asking for a miracle, Jack," she said, her voice gentler now. "I just need help with the ranch. Ethan needs someone to show him how to be strong, how to stand up for himself. I know it's a lot to ask, but if you could just stay for a little while, we'd be grateful. I'll make sure you have everything you need, food, shelter, and if you're willing to stay long enough, I'll make sure you're paid." There was a long pause as Jack considered her words. The fire crackled loudly in the silence, and Clara held her breath. She had made her case, and now all she could do was wait. Finally, Jack sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had been lifted. "I can't promise anything," he said, his voice low. "But I can stay for a little while, help you get things in order. But after that, I'll need to leave. I can't stay forever." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her, and for the first time in months she felt a spark of hope. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a start, and that was enough for now. "Thank you, Jack," she said quietly, her eyes welling up with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." Jack gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." As the conversation ended, Clara felt a new sense of determination. Jack might not be the perfect solution to all her problems, but he was a step in the right direction. For the first time in months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to get better. But she knew the road ahead would be tough. The next few days were busy, and Jack quickly proved his worth. He was a hard worker, taking on the tasks that Clara couldn't handle alone. He fixed broken fences, tended to the cattle, and even helped Clara with the repairs on the old barn. His presence was a comfort, and soon the ranch began to feel a little less empty. Despite his stoic nature, Clara began to see glimpses of the man behind the tough exterior. Jack wasn't the man he pretended to be. He had a soft side, one that he kept hidden from the world. And as the days passed, Clara couldn't help but notice how Ethan warmed to him. The young boy looked up to Jack with admiration, and Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for what Jack was doing for her son. Still, there was tension between them. Clara knew Jack wasn't ready to open up, and she wasn't sure if he ever would be. But she couldn't force him to share his past. She had to be patient. She just hoped that in time, Jack would see the family they could become. For now, though, Clara was content. The ranch was no longer silent, and for the first time in months she felt a flicker of hope. Jack's presence had brought something back to the ranch, something she had thought was lost forever. The days seemed to blur together as Clara and Jack worked side by side on the ranch. At first, Jack had kept his distance, focused only on the tasks at hand. He fixed fences, tended to the cattle, and mended the barn without saying much, but his actions spoke louder than words. Each morning, Clara watched him as he moved with quiet efficiency, his movements purposeful, as if he was trying to outrun his thoughts. She could see the weight he carried, the burdens that haunted him. He didn't talk much about himself, and she didn't press him. It was enough that he was there, helping in ways that she couldn't manage alone. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him. A man who wasn't just a worker, but someone who carried deep pain. Clara, on the other hand, found herself slowly shedding the walls she had built around her own heart. She was used to being strong for Ethan, but she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope as Jack's presence began to fill the empty spaces in her life. There was something comforting about having him around. His silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just his way. But even in his quiet, there were moments when he would glance at her, his eyes meeting hers for a second longer than usual, as if he was letting her in. Just a little. Clara told herself not to read too much into it, but it was hard not to notice. Ethan had also started to warm to Jack. The boy would often follow him around the ranch, mimicking his every move, trying to learn how to handle the horses and the cattle like Jack did. It was as if he saw Jack as a role model, someone who could teach him things his mother couldn't. Clara watched from a distance as Jack would patiently show Ethan how to saddle a horse or how to fix a broken fence. It made her heart swell with gratitude, even if she didn't always show it. She had been so worried about Ethan growing up without a father, but Jack seemed to be filling that role in his own way. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Clara was standing on the porch of the cabin, looking out at the ranch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the land. Jack was by the barn, tightening a loose nail on the gate. Ethan was running around nearby, his laughter echoing through the quiet evening. It was moments like these that Clara felt a sense of peace. The ranch was beginning to feel alive again. The air didn't feel so heavy with silence, and there was a new energy in the way they moved together. It was as if, despite the hardships, they were building something new. Jack approached her as the sun dipped lower, his boots making soft thuds against the ground. He stood a few feet away, not quite close enough to intrude on her space, but not far enough to be entirely distant. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice low but not unkind. Clara turned to look at him. "Just thinking," she replied, forcing a smile. "It's funny, you know? I've been here for so long, but it's only now, since you've been helping, that it feels like the ranch is alive again. I don't think I realized how much I was holding everything together by myself." Jack nodded, though he didn't say anything. His eyes flickered to the horizon where the last light of the day was slowly fading. Clara continued, her voice softer now. "Ethan's really taken to you, Jack. I think you're doing more for him than you realize." At that, Jack turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Clara held his gaze, wondering what he was thinking. For a brief moment she thought he might say something, but instead he simply nodded again. "I didn't know you had it in you," Clara added with a quiet laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "To be a father figure, I mean." Jack's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't react. He seemed to be lost in thought for a moment before he spoke again. "I'm not a father," he said, his voice lower than before, "and I never will be." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Clara had expected. She wasn't sure how to respond. Was he rejecting the idea of being involved with her and Ethan? Or was he simply stating a truth he couldn't change? Before she could speak, Jack continued. "But I can help. I can teach him what I know. What I've learned over the years. It's the least I can do." Clara nodded, not sure what else to say. There was something in his voice, something almost sad, that made her realize how deeply Jack was affected by the role he was playing. She didn't know his full story, but she could see the weight of it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself. He wasn't just a cowboy. He was a man who had been broken by life, who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from further pain. She understood, more than she could explain. She had built her own walls too after Tom died. It was easier to hide behind them than to face the uncertainty of the future. But somehow, with Jack here, those walls were beginning to crack. She didn't want to push him, but she also didn't want to lose this connection that was slowly forming between them. The following days were filled with the usual hard work, but there was something different in the air. Clara noticed how much Jack was softening, how his protective instincts toward Ethan were growing stronger. Jack wasn't perfect, and Clara didn't expect him to be, but his actions spoke volumes. He wasn't a man of many words, but the way he looked out for Ethan, teaching him how to hold a reins, how to handle a horse, how to be strong in the face of challenges, meant more than Clara could express. One evening, as the sun was setting and the ranch was quiet, Jack and Clara found themselves sitting side by side on the porch. Ethan had gone to bed, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. The night air was cool and the stars were beginning to twinkle overhead. "I used to hate the quiet," Jack said suddenly, breaking the peaceful silence. "It reminded me of everything I lost." Clara glanced at him, surprised by his words. "And now?" Jack looked out over the land, his face shadowed by the dimming light. "Now it's different. It's not so bad." Clara wasn't sure if he was talking about the ranch or something deeper, about himself, about the things he had been running from. She didn't ask. Sometimes it was better not to push. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara didn't need to speak. She could feel the change in Jack and the way he was starting to let himself belong again. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that they could build something together. That maybe, just maybe, they could be a family in their own way. As the night deepened, Jack finally stood up, stretching his long limbs. "I'll be out at the barn early tomorrow," he said, his usual quiet tone returning. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," Clara nodded. "I'll be there." As Jack walked back to the barn, Clara stayed on the porch for a moment longer. She looked up at the stars, wondering about the future. It was still uncertain, still full of challenges. But she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Days passed on the ranch, and the steady rhythm of work began to fill the air with a sense of purpose. Clara had always known that survival in the Wild West was never easy. But with Jack's help, the ranch was slowly starting to regain its strength. The fences were repaired, the cattle were stronger, and the crops were showing signs of growth again. The land that had seemed so lifeless and barren was now starting to breathe once more. There was hope, something Clara hadn't felt in a long time. But even as the ranch was coming back to life, there was something lurking on the horizon, a shadow from Jack's past that neither he nor Clara could escape. One afternoon, as Clara was in the kitchen preparing supper, she heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. She looked out the window, expecting to see Jack returning from the fields. But instead, her heart sank as she saw a group of men riding into the ranch. Their horses kicked up dust as they rode in, and the sight of them made Clara feel uneasy. They weren't the kind of men who usually came to town. Clara's stomach tightened. She had a sinking feeling that these men weren't here for a friendly visit. She stood frozen in place for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had no idea who these men were, but she could tell from their rough appearances and the way they rode in with purpose that they were trouble. She quickly looked around the cabin, wondering where Jack was. But he wasn't in sight. The men dismounted from their horses, each of them wearing worn-out clothes and heavy boots. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward and knocked on the door. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated for a moment before walking over to open it. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man with the scar smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "You're Clara Dawson, right?" he asked, his voice gruff. Clara nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, that's me. What do you want?" "We're looking for Jack Marshall," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "He's been avoiding us for too long, and we've come to collect." The words hit Clara like a punch in the gut. She knew instantly that this wasn't good. Jack's past was catching up with him. "Jack isn't here right now," Clara said, trying to stay calm. "But if you want to leave a message, I can make sure he gets it." The man with the scar took a step closer, his eyes scanning the cabin behind her. "We'll wait for him," he said, his voice cold. "He's got some things to answer for." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't know what Jack had done in his past, but she knew it wasn't good. She could see it in the way the men looked at her, like they were waiting for something that would make all of this make sense. "I don't know when Jack will be back," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. "But if you'd like to come back later, I'll be sure to tell him you're looking for him." The man with the scar just grinned. "No need for that, ma'am. We'll wait right here." "We're in no rush," Clara's mind raced. She needed to find Jack, and fast. She couldn't let these men stay on her ranch, not with Ethan inside and the threat of danger hanging over them. She quickly excused herself and stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. Her heart was racing as she moved toward the back of the cabin, where she knew Jack had stashed his horse. He had warned her that his past might come back to haunt him someday, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. She had seen the pain in his eyes when he talked about leaving his old life behind, and now it was clear that the past didn't let go so easily. Clara grabbed her shawl and hurried outside, her mind spinning with worry. She had to warn Jack. But as she reached the edge of the property, she saw him coming from the barn, his face set in a determined expression. "Jack," she called out, running toward him. "There are men here, rough-looking men. They're asking for you." Jack's eyes darkened as he heard her words. He didn't say anything at first, but his body tensed, and Clara could see that he was preparing for something. "Are they still here?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Clara nodded. "They're waiting by the cabin." "They're not leaving." Jack didn't waste another moment. He grabbed his reins and mounted his horse in one swift movement. "Stay inside with Ethan," he said, his voice firm. "I'll handle this." Clara's heart ached as she watched him ride toward the cabin, but she knew she couldn't stop him. This was his past, and it was clear that it wasn't something he could run from any longer. She quickly returned to the cabin, locking the door behind her and making sure Ethan was safely inside. She sat with her son, trying to keep her face calm and reassuring, but inside, her mind was racing. What was going to happen? Who were these men? What had Jack done to make them come after him like this? It didn't take long before the sound of hooves filled the air again. Clara stood up, her breath caught in her throat. She went to the window and peered out, her heart pounding. She could see Jack and the men standing in front of the cabin now, their voices low and angry. She couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but she could tell that the conversation was tense. Jack was standing tall, his body rigid, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun. Clara's stomach twisted as she watched the scene unfold. She had never seen Jack like this before. The man who had been so gentle with Ethan, the one who had worked so hard to help her save the ranch, was now a stranger, someone surrounded by danger. Just as she was about to open the door and go to Jack, she heard the sound of gunshots. Her heart stopped and she rushed to the door, but before she could open it, the shooting stopped. There was a long, tense silence, and then she heard Jack's voice, calm but firm. "Get off my land," he said. The men didn't argue. Slowly they began to walk away, mounting their horses and leaving as quickly as they had arrived. Clara's heart was still racing and she couldn't bring herself to move. She stood frozen at the door, waiting for Jack to come back. When Jack finally returned, his expression was hard, but there was a weariness in his eyes. Clara could see that the confrontation had taken a toll on him, but he didn't say anything. He dismounted his horse and looked at her as if silently telling her everything was fine. But Clara could see that it wasn't fine. His past had come back and it wasn't going away anytime soon. In this expanded Part 4, the tension between Jack's past and present comes to the forefront. The arrival of dangerous men brings danger to Clara and Ethan, and it forces Jack to confront the consequences of the life he left behind. Clara, now fully aware of the danger Jack is in, faces the reality that Jack's past will always be a part of their lives. This section builds the tension and foreshadows the challenges they will face as they continue to build their future together. The morning after the encounter with the men from Jack's past, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to the air. The sun had risen as usual, casting a warm glow over the ranch, but the sense of danger hadn't lifted. The men had left, but Clara knew deep down that this wasn't over. Jack's past was a shadow that would continue to follow him, no matter how hard he worked to leave it behind. Jack had hardly said a word since the confrontation. He spent the morning fixing the fences again, his movements quick and precise, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Clara didn't press him. She knew he was processing everything in his own way, but every time she caught his gaze, she saw the same wariness in his eyes, the same caution that had been there ever since he first stepped onto her ranch. It wasn't just about the danger from those men. It was about the life Jack had tried so hard to escape. Clara had learned a lot about Jack over the past few weeks. She had seen the rough exterior, the cowboy who worked hard, kept to himself, and avoided showing weakness. But she had also seen glimpses of something softer underneath, something more vulnerable. She had heard the quiet pain in his voice when he spoke about his past, the life he had left behind and the scars he carried. She had watched him grow attached to Ethan, guiding him like a father figure even though Jack hadn't asked for that role. In his own way, Jack had opened up to Clara, but there was still a wall between them, one that she couldn't quite reach. After lunch, as the wind picked up and the sky began to cloud over, Jack came into the cabin, his boots kicking up dust as he stepped inside. His usual quiet presence filled the room, and Clara looked up from the stove, her heart sinking at the expression on his face. He was holding a letter in his hand, its edges worn and crumpled. It wasn't addressed to him, but Clara knew who it was for. "Clara," Jack said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's from the bank." Clara felt her stomach twist. The letter had been a long time coming. She had been avoiding it, hoping that somehow something would change, but she knew better. The ranch had barely turned a profit since Tom died. Every bill, every debt had been piling up, and she hadn't been able to keep up with the payments. The bank had already warned her once that if she couldn't pay soon, they would take the land. She had been trying to keep it from Jack, but there was no more hiding the truth. She reached for the letter, her fingers trembling. She didn't need to open it to know what it would say. She could already feel the weight of it. This was the final warning. Jack watched her carefully, his eyes softening as she read the letter in silence. When she finished, Clara set the letter down on the table and took a deep breath. "I knew this day was coming," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "The bank wants me to pay, and if I can't, they'll take the ranch. They'll take everything." Jack's expression hardened. "How much do they want?" Clara shook her head. I don't know if I can come up with that much. I've tried everything I can think of. I've sold off some of the cattle, but it's still not enough. I don't know what else to do. There was a long pause, and for a moment the only sound in the cabin was the wind howling outside. Then Jack spoke, his voice low but firm. I can help you, he said. Clara looked up, surprised by his words. What do you mean? Jack took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. I've got some money saved up. It's not a lot, but it's enough to cover what you owe. I can lend it to you and we can pay off the bank together. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure whether to be relieved or overwhelmed by the offer. Jack had never spoken about his savings before, and now he was offering everything he had to save her ranch. The gesture was kind, but it also made her feel vulnerable. She didn't want to rely on him. She didn't want to take more from him than she already had. I can't ask you to do that, Jack, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. You've already done so much for me. I can't keep taking from you. Jack stepped closer, his expression softening. It's not about taking, Clara, it's about helping. I know what it's like to be stuck, to feel like there's no way out. You've been helping me in ways you don't even realize. You've given me a reason to stay, a reason to fight. Clara's heart tightened as she listened to him. She had never thought of it that way. She had always seen herself as the one who needed help. But now she saw that Jack was offering her more than just money. He was offering her a chance to keep going, to keep fighting for the ranch, for her son, for their future. I don't know how to thank you, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Jack gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you won't give up. Clara nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude flood through her. Jack's offer wasn't just about saving the ranch, it was about showing her that she wasn't alone. They were in this together. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Clara sat on the porch gazing at the stars. The night was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jack had gone to bed early, exhausted from the day's work, but Clara couldn't sleep. Her mind was still racing with thoughts of the ranch, the bank, and the future. Jack's offer had been a lifeline, but it also made her question everything. She wasn't used to relying on anyone. She had spent so many years trying to do everything on her own, to keep her family intact, that the idea of accepting help, especially from Jack, was overwhelming. She couldn't deny the way she felt about him. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he had been there for her and Ethan, that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, they could have more than just a business relationship. But she couldn't let herself get carried away. She had to focus on what was in front of her, saving the ranch, keeping her son safe, and making sure they had a future. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Jack walking toward her, his silhouette outlined by the faint light from the cabin. You're still awake? Jack asked, his voice low and quiet. Clara smiled faintly. Can't sleep, she said. Too much on my mind. Jack nodded and sat down beside her, his presence solid and comforting. I know what you mean, he said, his voice carrying a quiet understanding. They sat in silence for a long time, just watching the stars. It was a peaceful moment, a moment of quiet connection, and for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever the future held, she knew that with Jack by her side, they could face it together. I don't know what comes next, Clara said finally, her voice soft but steady. But I'm not giving up. I can't, not for Ethan and not for us. Jack looked at her, his eyes serious but warm. We'll get through this, Clara, one step at a time. Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone anymore. They would face whatever came next together as a family.